The morning I stopped being invisible started the way all the worst mornings had, with my name said wrong. Not mispronounced, deliberately mangled. Drawn out like taffy until it meant something smaller than what my mother had intended when she chose it. I was standing at the edge of the east courtyard of Valentry University with a coffee thermos in one hand and my binder full of color-coded research tabs in the other, and Priya Solano said my name the way she'd been saying it for 3 years, like a joke that hadn't gotten old for her, even if it had for everyone else in earshot. The girls around her laughed on cue. The girls always laughed on cue. That was the ecosystem of the courtyard at 7:48 in the morning, and I had learned to move through it the way you learn to move through a room with low furniture, carefully, without looking up. My name is Nadia Voss. I am 22 years old, an Omega who presented late, at 19, which earned me its own small taxonomy of whispers, the kind that follow you into lecture halls and linger by the drinking fountains. Late presenter. Probably defective. Couldn't even do the basic biological thing on schedule. I am a third-year biochemistry student with a 4.0 GPA that exactly nobody noticed, a scholarship that covered tuition and nothing else, and the ability to read a mass spectrometry output the way most people read a headline. That last part is not metaphor. It is the thing that will matter most before this story is done. I did not look up at Priya. I angled my thermos and my binder and my too big cardigan toward the science block, the way I always did, the way that kept me separate and therefore safe, and I had almost made it past the fountain when I heard the courtyard go quiet. Not quiet the way it goes quiet for a fire drill, quiet the way it goes quiet when something with weight moves through it. I looked up then. I couldn't help it. She was walking from the main gate toward the administrative building, and she was alone, which no one with her kind of gravity is ever supposed to be. She was tall. She wore a charcoal wool coat that had been cut by someone who understood what shoulders are for. Her hair was dark and pulled back in a way that said, I am not interested in softening anything about myself for your comfort. She did not look at the fountain. She did not look at Priya and the girls, who had stopped mid-laugh with their mouths slightly open. She did not look at the coffee cart, or the banner for the spring gala, or any of the things that the courtyard offered to be looked at. She looked at me, not through me, not past me. At me for 1 full second, maybe 2, long enough that I felt it in my sternum, which is the most embarrassing thing I have ever admitted. And then she walked into the administrative building, and the door closed, and the courtyard exhaled all at once, like a held note finally released. Who is that? I heard myself say. And I wasn't talking to anyone in particular. The girl nearest me, a second year I barely knew, who sometimes sat in the same section of the library, said, in a voice that carried actual awe, "That's Cassian Vael." I knew the name. Everyone at Valentry knew the name. Cassian Vael did not attend classes here. She had graduated from this university at 20 with 2 degrees and a thesis the biochemistry department had framed and mounted in the main hall, which I had read approximately 40 times. She was 28 now. She ran the Vail Institute, which was not exactly a corporation, and not exactly a research foundation, and not exactly a pharmaceutical empire, but occupied the uncomfortable intersection of all three. She had a press epithet that had followed her since she was 23, and it had appeared in the Financial Observer, and then never left, the still point. As in, the eye of the storm. As in, nothing moves her. She was an alpha. Obviously, you could feel it in the way the air redistributed itself around her. Her scent hit me half a second after she was already past. I caught the trailing edge of it in the courtyard's morning chill, and it was not what I expected. Not the aggressive thunderstorm register of the Alpha Boys who had made my first year here into something I did not like to think about. This was different. Smoked cedar and cold iron, not a threat. A fact. I stood in the courtyard with my thermos and my binder and my too big cardigan, and my heart was doing something measurable and inconvenient, and I was late for lab. If you're new here, subscribe to the channel. There's a lot more where this came from, and you're going to want to stay. I did not think about Cassian Vielle for the rest of the morning. That is a lie. I thought about her the way you think about a splinter, with regular involuntary attention and a wish that it would either resolve itself or stop calling for yours. I was running a gel electrophoresis for Professor Delacante's lab, and the bands were separating cleanly, and I was noting the migration distances. And I was thinking, smoked cedar and cold iron. What an unexpected combination for a woman whose institute's last published paper had overturned a 20-year assumption about omega hormonal suppression pathways. I had read that paper 7 times. I had not told anyone I had read that paper 7 times. At 11:30, the lab door opened and Delacante came in with his reading glasses on top of his head, which meant he had bad news and was hoping his glasses would prevent him from having to see the consequences of it. He stood at the front of the room and said that the university had agreed to host an external review of its research-grade containment facilities, and the review team would be arriving Thursday, and he would need 1 student to prepare the full documentation portfolio, every protocol log, every calibration record, every incident report for the past 2 years, by Wednesday at 9 a.m. The room made a specific sound, the sound of 15 people suddenly finding reasons to be very interested in their pipettes. I said, "I'll do it." Delacante looked at me over his glasses, free face. "It's approximately 400 documents, Miss Voss." "I know what's in the files," I said, because I did. I had been the one filing most of them. He said fine and left quickly, which is what he always did when something had been handled. The girl at the bench next to mine, Sarah Okafor, who was my best friend in the way that 2 people who survive the same difficult ecosystem become best friends, out of mutual recognition and the shared economy of sandwiches, looked at me and said, "You are doing it again." "Doing what?" "The thing where you volunteer for the impossible project and then actually do it, and then no one gives you any credit and you act like that's fine." "It will be fine." "Nadia, I need the access hours for the archive room," I said, which was true, and also not the whole truth. The whole truth was that I had been trying to make myself useful enough to be kept for 3 years, and I had not yet found the ceiling of that strategy, and I was not ready to stop trying. Sarah looked at me for a moment and then handed me half her protein bar, which is the highest form of love she knows how to express, and which I accepted accordingly. I started on the documentation that afternoon. I worked through dinner and most of the evening, pulling files and cross-referencing and flagging 3 incidents that had been logged incorrectly, not hidden, just miscategorized, the kind of bureaucratic slippage that happens in any research facility operating at the edge of its capacity. I corrected the categorizations and noted the corrections, and at 10:47 p.m., I was walking back from the archive room to the dormitory wing with my bag over one shoulder and the beginning of a tension headache over my left eye when I turned a corner and nearly walked directly into someone. My thermos hit the floor. My binder stayed in my arms through sheer reflex. "I'm so sorry," I said, already crouching for the thermos. "It's recovered," said a voice like a sentence that had decided it didn't need a question mark. I looked up. Smoked cedar and cold iron, warmer now in the enclosed corridor. Cassian Vielle was holding my thermos and looking at me with an expression I could not categorize, which already put her in rare company. She was with a woman I didn't know, shorter, beta, with close-cropped silver hair, and the bearing of someone whose job title contained at least 3 words you wouldn't find in a dictionary of ordinary occupations. The woman was holding a tablet and had stopped walking the moment Cassienne stopped walking, with the fluency of someone who has been doing exactly this for a long time. I stood up. I was aware that I was holding a binder full of color-coded tabs and wearing a cardigan that had been washed enough times to lose its original opinion about its own shape. Cassienne Vael held my thermos out to me. She had not stopped looking at me. It was the same look from the courtyard, not through me, at me, and in the enclosed light of the corridor it was considerably harder to dismiss. "You're the student who took the documentation project," she said. It was not a question. She'd clearly already known the answer. Yes, I took the thermos. Our fingers did not touch. I noted the fact of my noticing that they didn't. Delicante didn't assign it to someone from the methodology track. No, you volunteered. Yes, something shifted in her expression. A very small thing, a degree or two, like a compass needle adjusting to a new north. Why? "Because I knew the files," I said, "and because someone was going to have to do it correctly." The silence lasted exactly long enough to become interesting. The silver-haired woman glanced between us with an expression that had made a decision to be professionally blank about whatever it was witnessing. "The review team is mine," Cassienne said. "The Vail Institute is conducting the assessment. I'll be here through Saturday." She paused, and what lived inside that pause was not nothing. "I'd like the documentation on my desk by Tuesday evening, not Wednesday morning." I held my thermos and my binder. I said, "That's a day earlier than agreed." "Yes, that's a significant additional constraint." "I know what it is, Miss Voss." She knew my name. She had said my name correctly, the full weight of both syllables, the way my mother had intended. And I had no workable theory for how she already knew it, or what I was supposed to do with the warmth that moved through my chest at hearing it said that way. "I can have it done by Tuesday evening," I said. She looked at me for one more second. 2, smoked cedar and cold iron, and something underneath that I couldn't name yet. Something warmer and more carefully contained. Then she walked past me, and the silver-haired woman followed without a word, and I stood alone in the corridor holding a slightly dented thermos and trying to get my breathing back to its usual unremarkable pace. I did not manage it for quite some time. Her name was Wren Salter, the silver-haired woman. I found this out later. I'm getting ahead of myself. At this point, she was simply the woman who looked at things with the particular attention of someone whose job requires her to catalog the significant and discard the rest, and who had, in the corridor, seemed to decide that what she had just witnessed belonged in the former category. I worked until 2 in the morning. I went to sleep thinking about smoked cedar. I had the documentation ready by Tuesday at 6 p.m., That should tell you something about what I was willing to do for a woman I had met in a corridor for approximately 90 seconds. It should also tell you something about the degree to which I was aware that the documentation had already gone from being about the review to being about something else entirely. Something I did not have a clean category for, which was a problem, because I have a clean category for nearly everything. I delivered the portfolio to the administrative annex where the Institute's review team had set up. There was a student assistant at the front desk who looked at me with the automatic dismissal that I had learned was simply the default setting of people who spent time near power. I gave my name. I was told to leave the portfolio at the desk. I set it down and turned to go. Voss, I turned back. Cassienne was in the doorway of the inner office, coat off, sleeves rolled to the elbow, the first time I had seen her without the armor of the wool coat, and she was somehow more formidable without it, which was not the way that usually worked. She had a pen in one hand and a look on her face that I was starting to learn meant she had already been thinking about something for longer than she was going to admit. "Come in," she said, not asking. I went in. The office had been reorganized since that morning, which I could tell because there was a logic to the reorganization that matched the logic of someone who processes information spatially. My documentation portfolio was already open on the desk, not the cover, but page 63, which was the corrected incident categorization section. "You found 3 filing errors," she said, behind me now, and I turned to find she had moved to the window. The late afternoon light came in at an angle that did something unfair to the line of her jaw. "Errors is generous," I said. "Miscategorizations. The data was there. It was just shelved wrong." 2 years of filing, and Delacante's team missed all 3. "They were subtle. You weren't on the original documentation team." "No, you read the existing files before volunteering." I had, in fact, spent 6 months reading the lab's documentation logs for my own understanding of the facility's protocols, because that is the kind of person I am, and I have made a certain peace with it. "I read most things that are available to read," I said carefully. Cassian looked at me the way she had in the courtyard, the way she had in the corridor. That unrelenting attentiveness that I was beginning to understand was not a performance of interest, but actual interest, which was its own category of problem. "My lead analyst is reviewing your corrections," she said. "If they hold, the review timeline accelerates by a day and a half. They'll hold. You're certain. I'm certain." Another one of those pauses that was not empty. Smoked cedar and cold iron, and the warmer note underneath. I was close enough now to identify it, something like rain on warm stone, the particular smell of a place where something living had been, recently, trying to grow. "Sit down, Nadia," she said. "My name again. Correctly, I'd like to ask you some questions. For the record," I sat down. I answered questions for an hour and 20 minutes. She asked about my methodology, my research focus, my career trajectory, and what I thought was wrong with the current standard model of omega hormonal suppression. That last question made me go very still before I answered it, because the honest answer was a long one, and the honest answer was the one that had been sitting in my chest for 2 years, waiting for someone to ask the right question. I gave her the honest answer. She didn't write anything down. She just listened. And I understood somewhere around the 40-minute mark that being listened to by Cassian Vielle was a different experience from being listened to by most people. Because most people are listening to the surface of what you say, catching words to respond to, and Cassian was listening to the structure underneath, the argument, the evidence. The gap between what I claimed and what I could actually prove. At the end, she said, "Have you submitted any of this for publication?" "No, why not?" I thought about the way Priya said my name. I thought about the late presenter whispers. I thought about the 2 professors who had told me, in their different ways, that omega researchers in this subfield were a novelty that the serious journals weren't quite ready for yet. I said, "I haven't found the right venue." The look she gave me said she understood exactly what I had not said, and that she had filed it. "The Institute has a fellowship," she said. "Full research support, no teaching obligations, access to our synthesis lab, which you've been reading our papers about for," she paused, fractionally, some time. I held myself very still. "Are you offering me a fellowship?" "I'm telling you the fellowship exists," she said, "and that application's open in March. I'm also telling you that the selection committee tends to find unsolicited preliminary data very compelling." She stood up, which was the end of the meeting, and I stood too, and she said, "The corrections will hold. You were right to be certain." I gathered my bag. My heart was doing the measurable and inconvenient thing again. At the door I stopped because I couldn't not ask, and I turned back and said, "How did you know my name?" In the corridor, Cassian Vielle looked at me from across the room she had reorganized to make sense to her own mind, and something moved through her expression, not the careful nothing of a practiced executive, but something that had been sitting underneath that for long enough to have its own gravity. She said, "I read most things that are available to read." She was quoting me back to myself, 30 minutes after I'd said it. I walked out of the office and down the corridor and into the late afternoon air, and I stood outside the administrative annex with my bag on my shoulder and the late light in my eyes, and I thought, she remembers everything. That answer should not have changed anything. It did anyway. Sarah was waiting for me at the library entrance with an expression that had decided to be professionally blank but was losing the battle. I walked up to her, and she looked at me, and then at my face, and said, "Your scent is doing something." I said, "I don't know what you're talking about. It's doing the warm orange blossom thing, which is what it does when you're—" "I need to tell you about the last 2 hours," I said. We went inside, and I told her. She ate 3 granola bars, which is her equivalent of active listening. When I was done, she said, "Nadia, she knows your name." She explained that. She didn't explain that. She deflected with your own words because she didn't want to say I looked you up before I went to that corridor. Which is what she did. She peeled a 4th granola bar. "She found you first," Sarah said. "In the courtyard. She found you before the corridor. The corridor wasn't an accident." I thought about this. Nadia, the still point of the Vale Institute, went looking for you specifically in a courtyard full of Valentry students before she'd spoken a single word to you. You need to sit with that. I sat with it. The thing I kept coming back to was not the fellowship, though the fellowship was real and enormous and represented everything I had been working toward. The thing I kept coming back to was the look, the way she had looked at me in the courtyard, not past me, not through me. The way you look at something you already know the value of and are simply confirming the assessment. I had been looked at a lot of ways in my life. I had never been looked at like that. 3 weeks passed in a state of productive disquiet. I worked on my preliminary data with a focus that surprised even me, which is a high bar. The corrections held. Ren Salter sent a single-sentence confirmation through the university's administration system on Wednesday morning. The review concluded successfully on Friday. I did not see Cassian again during that time, which should have been a relief and was instead the kind of absence that has a specific texture, like the space where a piece of furniture used to be. Priya and her group had noticed something in the way that organisms attuned to social architecture notice disruption. I was aware of them watching me differently, not more kindly, but differently, with the recalibrating quality of people who have filed you as harmless and are now checking whether they need to update that assessment. I did not care about Priya. I cared, more than I wanted to admit, about a woman who smelled like smoked cedar and cold iron and warm rain on stone, who had arrived at Valentry to review a research facility and had apparently, somewhere in the process, decided to review me instead. The fellowship application portal opened on a Wednesday in March. On Thursday, I had a message in my university account from an address I didn't recognize, which resolved itself into the Vale Institute's internal domain when I looked more carefully. The message said, "Your preliminary mass spec data is compelling. The argument has a gap at step 4. Fix it before you submit." And then, below that, a single line, "Dinner Thursday, the Meridian on Callaway, 7. Not a question. Not an invitation with an RSVP. A statement with a time." I showed Sarah. She looked at the screen for a long time and then said, "She found the gap in your argument." Yes, she read your preliminary data. Apparently, Nadia, she reviewed your unpublished research. I know, you're going to dinner. I think I'm going to dinner, I said. You're going to dinner, Sarah said, with the confidence of someone who has already added this to the story she's going to tell about me. I fixed the gap. It took until 6:15 Thursday evening, which gave me 45 minutes, which was enough time to change out of the cardigan into the one good blazer I owned, a deep plum thing that Sarah had made me buy for academic conference season and that I had worn exactly twice. The Meridian was not the kind of restaurant where I would normally find myself. The floors were limestone. The lighting was the particular warm amber of places that have decided your discomfort with being seen is not their problem. I gave my name at the door and was led to a corner table where Cassian was already seated, looking at the window, and the evening light was doing something to the line of her jaw again. The same unfair thing, and I understood that I was simply going to have to accept that this was a fact about her and adjust accordingly. She looked up when I sat down. You fixed the gap. How do you know I fixed it? Because you're here and not somewhere rewriting it. The corners of her mouth moved, just barely, in a direction that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. You found it the moment I named it, didn't you? You already knew it was there. I had known there was something slightly soft in step 4 for 3 weeks. I had a hypothesis about the gap, I said, and you didn't fix it until I noted it. I was busy. You weren't busy. You were unconvinced it mattered until someone whose opinion you weighted told you it did. She said this without judgment, in the way she said most things, as a fact she had assembled from available evidence and was now reporting. That's not a flaw. It's calibration. You need a reader who takes you seriously. The words landed somewhere in my chest and stayed there. I picked up the menu and held it and pretended to read it. We ordered. The waiter treated Cassian with the particular deference that attaches itself to people who do not need to signal their power because the room already knows. She ordered without looking at the menu, which meant she had already decided what she wanted before she arrived, which was a small fact that I filed alongside all the other small facts I had been involuntarily filing about her. Tell me about the gap, she said, how you fixed it. I told her. She listened the way she had in the office, to the structure, not the surface. She asked 3 questions. They were the right 3 questions. My data held under all of them. Your advisor isn't pushing the publication, she said. It was the Delicante observation, gentle and precise. My advisor is supportive, I said carefully. Your advisor is comfortable, she said. There's a difference. You already know this. She set her glass down with a small, deliberate care. The fellowship is real. The position is real. I would like you to apply, and I would like the data to be ready when you do. That's the professional context of this dinner. And the non-professional context, I said, before I had entirely finished deciding to say it. The pause was longer this time. Smoked cedar and cold iron, the rain on stone warmth more present in the enclosed air of the restaurant, warmer than the courtyard. Warmer than the corridor, and I was aware that my own scent had done the orange blossom thing Sarah had flagged, which there was nothing I could do about. That, Cassian said, is a more complicated question than the fellowship. I know, I said. I still asked it. She looked at me, and she said, with the care of someone who does not say things carelessly, I would like to earn the right to answer it. The dinner lasted 2.5 hours. We argued about omega suppression research for most of it, with an intensity that the adjacent tables found either compelling or alarming, and it was the best argument I had ever been in, because she was right about the things she was right about and wrong about exactly 2 things, and when I showed her why she was wrong, she did not double down. She just said, yes, you're right, and updated. I had never met anyone who did that. Walking back from the restaurant, the spring evening cold enough that my breath made small clouds in the amber light, I thought about what she'd said. I would like to earn the right to answer it. Not a deflection. Not a performance of humility, an actual statement of intent by a woman who I was becoming increasingly convinced did not say anything she didn't mean. I submitted my fellowship application 2 weeks later, with the gap in Step 4 repaired, the argument clean and exact, and, for the first time, confident. On the morning it went in, there were flowers on my dorm room doorstep. Not expensive generic. A small bundle of lemon tree cuttings, bitter and bright and specific, the exact thing I had mentioned in passing over dinner that my mother had grown in window boxes when I was a child. I had mentioned it once, in a sentence, as an aside about the olfactory memory literature. She had heard it. She had filed it. She had come back to it. I held the lemon cuttings in my hands in the corridor outside my room, and Sarah opened her door across the hall and looked at me, and then at the cuttings, and then back at me, and said, "Oh, you are in so much trouble." I was not in trouble. Or I was in precisely the kind of trouble I had not known I was looking for until the courtyard, and the one look, and the name said correctly, and the question, why? But the trouble was about to get considerably more complicated because there was someone else in the ecosystem of Cassian Vale's life, and she had noticed me noticing. Her name was Imelda Crane. I learned it the way you learn the names of weather systems, from the patterns of damage before you see them coming. She was beautiful in the way that things designed to be looked at are beautiful, deliberately, expensively, without a centimeter of accident. She had been at Cassian's side at the Institute's Spring Research Symposium I had attended as a visiting student, which is to say I was in the back row, which is to say I had a perfect, unobstructed line of sight to the front of the room. Imelda Crane was an Institute board member, an alpha, and she moved through the room with the confidence of someone who has long since decided that the things she wants are already hers, pending the formality of acquisition. I watched her place her hand on Cassian's arm. I watched Cassian's jaw do a very small and precise thing, not quite tension, not quite dismissal. And then I watched Cassian look across the room and find me in the back row, and the thing that happened in her expression when she did was not nothing. Imelda followed the look. She found me. She assessed me in the way that certain kinds of alphas assess omegas who are in their operational vicinity, which is to say thoroughly and without warmth. Then she smiled, which was the part I should have paid more attention to. She came to find me at the refreshments table after the panel. "You must be Nadia Voss," she said. "Cass has mentioned you." "Cass, yes," I said. "The fellowship applicant." She said it the way Priya said my name, with the particular inflection that makes a true statement mean something smaller than the fact's support. She takes an interest in promising students. It's one of her more endearing qualities. She picked up a glass and smiled at me over it. She's loyal to them, too. Until she isn't, of course, but the Institute has excellent references. I looked at her. I understood what she was doing. I was not the kind of person who was unaware of what was being done to them. I was only, sometimes, the kind of person who had not previously had the social capital to do anything about it. "That's very kind," I said, in my most neutral register. "She's a complicated person to be close to," Imelda said. "I say that as someone who has known her for a long time." She set her glass down. "Just something to keep in mind." She moved away. I watched her go, and I thought about Cassian's jaw, doing its small, precise thing when Imelda touched her arm, and I thought about the lemon cuttings, and I thought about what Sarah had said. She found you first. I was going to need to be careful, not of Cassian. Of Imelda Crane, who had looked at me in the back row and calculated something, and had come to the refreshments table with a specific message dressed as small talk. I didn't say anything to Cassian that evening. I filed it. A week later, on a Tuesday morning at 8:42, Delaconte called me into his office. His reading glasses were on top of his head. He said that there had been a formal complaint lodged against me with the university's Research Integrity Board, an allegation that the corrections I had made to the documentation portfolio had been made with prior knowledge of the Institute's review criteria, which would constitute a conflict of interest and potentially a manipulation of the review process. I sat across from him in the hard wooden chair that all academic advice chairs are required by some ancient covenant to be, and I felt the room rearrange itself in the way that rooms rearrange when something load-bearing has been removed. "Who filed the complaint?" I said. Delaconte said he wasn't able to tell me. His glasses were covering his hairline. I said, "The corrections I made were to miscategorizations that predated any knowledge I had of the review. The original filing timestamps exist. The correction timestamps exist. The interval between them can be verified independently." "I know that," he said. "Then verify it," I said. He said the board process would take its course, I said, in a voice that did not shake because I was not going to give the chair or the room or the glasses the satisfaction of a shake. The corrections were accurate. "I will prove it." I walked to the archive room, and I pulled every original timestamp I had access to, and I photographed them, and I emailed the photographs to my own account, and then I went back to my lab bench and I worked with a focused precision that Sarah later described as mildly terrifying, and I did not allow myself to think about Imelda Crane's smile at the refreshments table, because if I thought about it, I would stop being precise and start being something else. At noon, my phone lit the bench with a message from Cassian's number. She had given it to me after the symposium. One line, no preamble, see Vale and the number. The message said, "I know about the complaint. I have the original logs. Come to the institute." I stared at my phone for 9 seconds. She already knew. She had already moved. She had not waited to see how I handled it. She had handled it, or begun to handle it, in parallel, while I was still sitting in Delaconte's wooden chair. I went to the institute. The institute's building on Calloway Street was different from anything I had imagined from the papers. The lobby was not the glass and logo of a corporate headquarters. It was a converted Victorian warehouse, raw brick and high windows, with a research floor visible through a glass partition and a lobby that smelled of coffee and something faintly chemical and, underneath both, smoked cedar. Wren Salter met me at the door. She had the same silver hair and the same tablet and the same air of cataloging the significant, and she led me to a meeting room on the second floor, without small talk, which I appreciated. Cassian was already there. She was standing, not sitting, which I was learning meant her attention was activated. She had the original file logs open on the screen behind her. She said, "The complaint was filed anonymously through a third-party ethics platform. The platform's access logs show a registration from a device connected to the Institute's own internal network." I went very still. Someone on the Institute's network filed it. Not someone who had any authorization to access that network for that purpose. She was watching me with the contained intensity that I was learning to read as anger held precisely in check, directed not at me, but at something just past my shoulder. "I don't make assumptions about who," she said. "I do make arguments from evidence." I thought about Imelda Crane. I thought about the particular smile. I thought about the words. Until she isn't, of course. "I have the original timestamps," I said. "I know. I do too. The complaint will fail on its own merits." She looked at me with the unrelenting attention. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer it honestly." "Yes, are you all right?" The question was so direct and so unexpected that I had to take a full second to process it. I had been asked in the past 24 hours whether I had documentation, whether I understood the process, whether I intended to contest the complaint. No one had asked me whether I was all right. "I'm managing," I said. "That's not what I asked." I looked at her, smoked cedar and cold iron and the rain on stone warmth, all of it closer and more present than the Institute's air conditioning and the coffee smell. I said, honestly, "No. Not entirely." She nodded, once, like someone receiving information they were going to use carefully. Then she said, "Sit down. I'll have someone bring you something to eat. Then we're going to go through this together." We went through it together. She had pulled not just the original logs, but the metadata, the actual creation times embedded in the file headers, which couldn't be altered without forensic traces. 3 hours later, I had an airtight chronological proof that every correction I had made preceded any possible foreknowledge of the Institute's review criteria. Rensalter had it formatted and time-stamped and delivered to the Integrity Board's electronic submission portal by 5:15 p.m. At 5:40, I was in the lobby with my coat on and my bag over my shoulder, and Cassian was beside me, which was not where I had expected her to be. "I should go," I said. "I'll walk you out." She walked me out. The evening had gone the particular deep blue of late spring, the streetlights just beginning to resolve against the remaining light, and there was something about the air and the blue and the cedar and the exhaustion that made the whole architecture of careful professional distance feel suddenly and specifically inadequate. "You didn't have to do any of that," I said. "The logs. The formatting, that was," I stopped. "You didn't have to." "I know I didn't have to," she said. "Why?" She stopped walking. I stopped walking. The street was not empty, but it was quiet in the way that spring evenings manage, and she turned to look at me, and there was something in her expression that was not the careful nothing of the executive, or the precision of the analyst, or even the almost smile of the restaurant. It was something more undefended than any of those, she said. Because the first time I walked through that courtyard, I was not planning to stop. I stopped for very few things. The sentence hung between us, exact and complete. I said, very quietly, and she said, "And you were standing at the edge of the fountain holding a thermos and a binder and a cardigan that had clearly been to war, and you weren't looking at me." Everyone in that courtyard was looking at me. You were looking at the building, like you had already decided what the day required of you and were calibrating accordingly. And she stopped. Something moved in her jaw. I found that I could not continue walking. The streetlight was amber. The evening was deep blue. I could hear my own pulse in a way that was inconvenient and probably visible. "That was 4 months ago," I said. "I know how long ago it was." "You've been patient," she said. Deliberately, because you deserved the time to see it clearly, and because I needed to earn, she stopped again, what I said I wanted to earn. I thought about the dinner. The lemon cuttings, the complaint and the 3 hours and the evidence filed at 5:15. I thought about my name said correctly, repeatedly, from the first moment. "Cassian," I said, first time I'd said her name. She went very still. The alpha stillness, the still point, but not the cold version, the public version. The stillness of someone who has arrived at a threshold and is not moving through it until they're certain the other person is there too. I said, "I see it clearly." A muscle in her throat moved. She looked at me with everything she had, which was considerable, and then she said, "There's a question I need to ask." "Ask it." "Can I?" She started again, careful, deliberate. "May I take you to dinner?" Not a professional dinner, A dinner where neither of us talks about the fellowship at all. I looked at her, at the building behind her, and the amber light, and the deep blue evening, and the extraordinarily specific human being, standing in all of that, looking at me like I was the axis the street had decided to organize around. "Yes," I said. "But only if you tell me what the warmer note in your scent is. I've been trying to identify it for months." Something happened in her face that I can only describe as light being let in. "Rain on cedar bark," she said, after the first storm of the season. "My mother's garden in the mountains. She died when I was 11, and I never understood why her scent stayed with me until she stopped. Her jaw did the small, precise thing. Until recently, I held that. I held it with the care it deserved." The dinner happened on Friday. No fellowship talk. We talked about her mother's garden, and my mother's window boxes, and a paper we both disagreed with for different reasons, and the particular satisfaction of a mass spec output that matches your prediction exactly. She laughed, twice, at things I said, not the polite laugh of a person in a professional context, but the real laugh. The one that happens before you decide whether to let it, and which told me something about her that the cedar and the cold iron and the rain on stone had only begun to suggest. By the second dinner, 2 weeks later, I had stopped pretending that the fellowship was the reason I walked to the Institute on Calloway Street 3 evenings a week. By the third dinner, I had stopped pretending anything. What I had not known yet was what Imelda Crane had done, and what she was prepared to do, and how much worse the next part was going to get before it got better. I should have known. The smile at the refreshments table should have told me. But I was in the middle of being seen by a person who saw me completely, and it is very hard to watch the horizon when you are looking at something close. The Integrity Board dismissed the complaint at the end of May. The decision was published in the faculty notice system at 9:14 on a Friday morning, and by 9:20 Priya Solano had seen it, and by 9:30 the Courtyard ecosystem had processed it in the way that Courtyard ecosystems process information, loudly, in clusters. With the specific discomfort of people who had been wrong about something and are deciding whether to acknowledge it. Sarah forwarded me the board decision with a message that said, "Receipts." I sent back, "I know." She sent back a photograph of herself holding a granola bar aloft, which is her version of a celebration. I was in the Institute's synthesis lab when I saw the notification. Cassian had arranged a visitor's access pass for me for the data collection phase of the fellowship work, which she had done with the same direct simplicity with which she did most things, which was to say she had simply told Ren Salter to arrange it, and Ren Salter had arranged it without visible commentary. I looked at the notification and felt the particular lightness of a weight I had been carrying for 3 weeks finally settling down somewhere it didn't hurt. Then I looked up, because Cassian was in the lab doorway. She had the expression I had come to understand meant she had already read the notification before I had. "Dismissed without findings," she said. "Yes, you're not surprised. The evidence was clear." It was. She came into the lab and looked at the spectrometer output I had been running and then back at me, and said with the quiet directness that had become its own form of intimacy, "Are you pleased?" "I'm relieved," I said. "There's a difference." The difference being, relief is the removal of a threat. Pleasure is the positive thing. The relief is that the threat is gone. I held her gaze. The pleasure is something else. The lab was very quiet. The spectrometer ran. Somewhere outside the window, the street noise of Calloway went about its business. Cassian said, very carefully, "May I tell you something?" "Yes, I find myself." She stopped. The jaw thing. I have managed the Institute for 6 years. I am not unaccustomed to managing things, including what I want and how I respond to it. She was choosing each word the way you choose each footfall on uncertain terrain. I am finding that particular management more difficult than usual. I said quietly, how difficult? Difficult, she said, in the way that having a precise instrument and wanting to use it for something it wasn't designed for is difficult. The instrument works, the purpose is new. I looked at her across the synthesizer. I said, what would it mean if you let it be difficult? The silence lasted long enough that I heard the spectrometer cycle through a full measurement sequence. Then she said, I'm not sure. I'd like to find out. I said, me too. We found out. Not all at once. She was not a person who moved without deliberateness, and I was not a person who had ever been given reason to rush toward something that felt like it was going to last. But that evening, walking back from the institute to the campus, the late light doing its best with the limestone buildings and the old plane trees, she took my hand. It was a specific, deliberate, unhurried act. Her thumb moved once across my knuckles. My scent did the orange blossom thing with a warmth I couldn't have suppressed if I'd tried. Her cedar and cold iron deepened into the rain on stone, and something new, amber. The particular heat of something that had been held in check for a long time, releasing into the air. I had been held by a hand before. I had not been held that way before. Like something claimed without the claiming being anything except a choice, freely made. We walked. The evening went on around us. I thought about the courtyard and the thermos and the cardigan and the look, and I thought, I have been walking toward this particular corner for a very long time without knowing it was a corner. The summer research sessions at the Institute began in June. Ren Salter, who had graduated from professional blankness to something in the vicinity of proprietary warmth regarding my presence in the building, gave me a bench assignment in the synthesis lab and a key card and a coffee mug. The mug was, I was fairly sure, her own personal mug, which had a chip in the handle, and which I later learned she had been using for 11 years. The fact that she gave it to me she described, when I mentioned it, as a procurement error. I noted this and said nothing, and kept the mug. By July, I had 3 months of preliminary data that were clean enough to get excited about. Cassian reviewed them on Thursday evenings, which had become a fixture. Dinner after, always non-professional, always the specific pleasure of two people who can argue about ideas with full force and feel the warmth of the argument instead of the heat. She was right 60% of the time. I was right 60% of the time. The math didn't add up, but neither of us was tracking it that way. Her apartment was on the 14th floor of a building on the river, and I saw it for the first time in late July when she invited me to dinner there because, she said, she had been meaning to cook since approximately March and had not done it. The apartment was what you would expect from a person who thought in structures and spatial logic and precise calibration, spare, high-ceilinged, with the kind of deliberate emptiness that costs more than fullness. The kitchen was fully equipped in a way that suggested it was used, which surprised me. And then didn't. She made risotto. She made it with a focused competence that was exactly what I should have predicted, and which I found specifically unreasonably attractive. I sat at the kitchen island and watched her stir and said, "You didn't learn this at the Institute." "My mother's cook," she said. Who decided that a child without a mother needed to know how to feed herself and was not subtle about the delivery of that lesson? I absorbed this. I thought about what she had said on the street about the rain on cedar bark scent and her mother's mountain garden. I thought about the inherited doctrine, the grief beneath the cold, and I said, "How old were you when she died?" 11. She stirred. My father's response was to install in me the belief that grief was a productivity failure, that love was a risk register, that the appropriate response to loss was to remove the conditions that produced it. She paused, just briefly. He was a very successful man, and a very wrong one, I said. She looked at me. The look was longer than usual. Yes, she said. I have recently begun to be certain of that. I ate the risotto, which was excellent. We sat at the table, and the river went silver and dark out the window, and she told me about the mountain garden, the terraced beds, the specific smell after rain, the way her mother had known every plant by its requirements rather than its name, and I told her about the window boxes and the lemon cuttings and my mother's belief that anything that needed direct sunlight was honest by definition. She laughed again, the real laugh. I had started to count them, 7 by that evening. At the door, leaving, she said, "Nadia." I stopped. "I would like to tell you something," she said, "and I would like to say it correctly, which may take a moment." I waited. She said, "I am not accustomed to wanting something that I can't simply organize. You are not a thing that can be organized. I find this, the jaw thing, remarkable. And I find you." She stopped, and I watched her assemble it. The most remarkable person I have met in a very long time. Possibly the most. And I am telling you this because I don't want you to be uncertain about it, and because I believe you have been uncertain about a great many things for a very long time, and I don't want to be one of them. The hallway of the 14th floor was quiet and amber lit, and smelled of cedar and rain on stone and orange blossom, and I said, "You're not." She crossed the remaining distance. She put one hand on my jaw, deliberate, unhurried. She said, "May I?" I said yes. She kissed me. Careful, specific, the way she did everything, with the precision of someone who has decided this is exactly what they mean to be doing, and is doing it completely. I kissed her back. The hallway went on being quiet. The river went on being silver out the windows 14 floors below. My heart did the measurable and inconvenient thing, and this time I let it, because it turned out that inconvenient, in the right context, was another word for true. We were something by August. Not a named thing yet. A developing thing, with the care of a compound that needs specific conditions to stabilize. I had my lab bench and my key card and my chipped mug and Ren Salter's version of warmth and 3 months of clean data, and I had Thursday evenings and the risotto and the river window and the 7th real laugh, multiplying into a number I had stopped tracking. And I understood, happier than I had been since, before I could identify what happy meant precisely enough to notice it. Then Imelda Crane came back, and I understood what the smile had been for. It started with a phone call to Delaconte. I only know this because Delaconte told me, in his office with his glasses on his forehead again, that a member of the Institute's board had expressed concern about a relationship between a senior staff member and a fellowship applicant that might compromise the selection process's integrity. The complaint has already been filed, he said, with the Institute's own ethics review structure. Not the university's. This is internal to the Vielle organization. I sat in the wooden chair. Imelda Crane, I said. Not a guess. I can't confirm, Professor Delaconte, I said. You can. He looked at his glasses. It was raised by a board member in a position to make the concern procedurally significant. The ethics review would pause all fellowship decisions. It would pause my data access. It would pause everything for an indeterminate period that was not about process at all, and we both knew it. I said, I need to make a call. I called Cassian from the corridor outside his office, and she answered before the second ring, which told me she already knew. Her voice was even, which was its own information. I know, she said. She's going to use the review to kill the fellowship, I said, and if the fellowship is compromised, she has an argument about the integrity of every data access I've had since June. She wants to make the data unusable. Yes, a pause. She's been on the board for 3 years. She has 2 aligned votes. If she calls a full board review, it will go on for months. Cassian, I stopped in the corridor. How much of this is about the fellowship, and how much of this is about you? Flat, certain, all of it. The first complaint was a test. She wanted to see whether I'd withdraw to protect the Institute's optics. A pause, shorter this time. I didn't. What does she want? She wants me to end this, and to install her in the role she has been waiting for, which is something I would not do when I was at the coldest I have ever been, and which I am substantially less capable of doing now. I heard her breathe once. She is going to use the review to make you a liability. I'm not going to let her. Cassian, my lead counsel is already preparing the documentation response. The chronology of the fellowship process is clean. Every decision point was formalized before I spoke to you outside the archive room in March, which is on record. The relationship disclosure is on file as of 2 weeks ago. I said, you filed the disclosure 2 weeks ago. Yes, which means you were planning for this. I was planning for the contingency. A beat. I plan for contingencies. It's a condition. I leaned against the corridor wall and I thought about the chess of it, her move 2 weeks ago, Imelda's move this morning, the moves underneath, and I thought about smoked cedar and cold iron and the word patient. I said, what do I do? Nothing, she said. The data is already archived on an external drive with independent timestamping. The Fellowship Selection Committee has been informed that the process is under review and the decision is suspended pending the outcome, not revoked. The 3 board members Imelda doesn't control are being briefed this afternoon. A very short pause. You go to the lab. You do your work. You are not a liability. I am not going to allow you to be positioned as one. I held the phone. The corridor was fluorescent and institutional and quiet. I said, I don't want you to do this alone. I know, she said. And then, lower, I'm not. I went to the lab. I did my work. I held the chipped mug and I did the thing I had always done in the face of something trying to make me small, which was to be larger than the space I was being assigned. At 4:17 p.m., Ren Salter appeared at the lab door and said, in her usual economical register, she'd like you upstairs. The conference room on the 3rd floor had a view of Calloway Street and the river beyond it. Cassian was there, and 2 people I didn't know, her counsel and another person whose function I understood from context. And when I walked in, she looked at me with the particular attention and said, simply, sit with me. I sat with her. The council presented the documentation response. It was comprehensive and precise and approximately the opposite of a vulnerability. When they left, Cassian and I sat at the conference table with the river view, and she said, Imelda has 3 moves left, mathematically, and you have counters to all 3. To 2. The 3rd depends on whether she's willing to go public with information that would damage the board's own reputation as much as mine. She looked at me. She might be. She's more willing to burn things than I estimated. What's the 3rd move? She contacts the press. She says the fellowship process was compromised from before it began, and she makes it about your access to the lab data and whether any of the preliminary findings are publishable. I understood the weight of that. 3 months of data. She'd be wrong, I said. Yes, we can prove she'd be wrong, but proof takes time, and time is damage. Her jaw did the thing. I'm not going to let her take 3 months of your work. I looked at her. The amber light of the late afternoon, the river silver in the distance, the chipped mug in my hands. I said, "Cassian, I need you to hear me." She looked at me. "Don't do anything that crosses a line you can't come back from," I said. "Whatever she does, however bad the third move is, I need you not to cross that line." A muscle in her throat. "She would destroy what you've built. And I will rebuild it if I have to. I have rebuilt before." I held her gaze. "The data is real. My work is real. She can slow it down. She can't unmake it. What she cannot do is make it untrue, and that's the only thing that matters." Cassian looked at me for a long time. The expression on her face was the one I had started to recognize from the evenings, from the real laughs, from the hallway on the 14th floor, the one where the careful nothing of the executive was completely gone, and what was underneath was visible and undefended and more formidable than the executive had ever been. She said, "You are the most infuriating person." "I know. You're telling me not to protect you. I'm telling you to protect both of us," I said, "by staying on the side of the line where we can both look at ourselves." She was quiet. She looked at the table, and then the river, and then me. She said, "I hear you." The third move happened the following Monday. It was smaller than it could have been, a carefully worded letter to a single journalist, impugning the fellowship process, calling the data methodologically compromised by apparent conflicts at the collection stage. The journalist called the Institute for comment. Cassian's response was published alongside the letter. The documentation response was also released, in full, with the independent timestamps. The journalist published both with a note that the allegations appeared unsupported by the available record. Imelda Crane resigned from the board at the end of that week. The resignation letter cited scheduling conflicts. The board's press release mentioned the enhanced ethics governance framework installed in the wake of the previous year's review. I read it twice and then filed it in the category of punished and accounted for, no further attention required. The Fellowship Selection Committee reconvened the following Thursday. I was not in the room. Cassian was, because she was the Institute's director, and because she had recused herself formally from the vote. Ren Salter texted me at 2:17 p.m. from inside the building. The text said 3-0. I was in the synthesis lab holding the chipped mug when I read it, and I sat very still for a moment, and then I put my head down on my forearms and breathed. Sarah, who had been sitting on a stool across the bench pretending to read but actually watching me, said quietly, "Hey." "Hey," I said into my forearms. 3-0? 3-0. She handed me a granola bar under my elbow. I laughed, which came out slightly wrong for a moment, and then righted itself. I sat up and ate the granola bar, and Sarah said, "I would like the record to show that I told you, in September, that she found you first." "The record shows," I said. "I would also like the record to show that I have been extremely supportive throughout this entire situation, and that when you write the paper, I deserve to be in the acknowledgments." The record shows that too. We sat in the lab, and the afternoon light came through the high windows at the particular angle of a summer that had used up most of itself, and I held my chipped mug and thought about the courtyard and the thermos and the cardigan and the one look, and about what it means to be seen clearly by one person in a world that has decided you are not worth the attention. It turns out, it means everything. That is the part that takes the longest to believe. The morning Cassian found me in the courtyard, she told me later. She had been at Valentry for a specific reason. The Institute's review was one half of it. The other half was something she had not told me until August, on the evening after the board vote, when we sat by the river window in the 14th floor apartment, and she said, "I read your faculty profile paper. The one in the Biosciences undergraduate journal, 18 months ago. The one about the suppression pathway gap. I went still. The faculty profile journal was not a prestigious venue. It was the student research showcase, the one that existed to give undergraduates a place to put preliminary ideas. I had published the paper with 3 stars and a note that said it was a student perspective, expecting nothing. I read it in November, she said. I read it 4 times. The argument was unsound in one specific place. Step 4, I said. Step 4. But the underlying hypothesis was, she stopped. Found the word. Revolutionary is not a word I use without calibration. Cassian, revolutionary, she said. If it's right. And I believe it's right. I held the glass in my hands and looked at the river. 18 months. She had read the paper 18 months ago. She had come to Vellentry in March, not only for the review. You were looking for me, I said. I was looking for the person who had written that paper, she said. I found you instead. I looked at her, and the person who had written the paper, she said, and you are not slightly different things. You are the same thing. You are someone who sat in a student showcase journal and planted an argument that could restructure an entire subfield, and then went back to being invisible, because no one had told you yet that invisible was not the only option. She set her glass down with the small, deliberate care. I wanted to tell you, I held this for a long time. The river went silver. The amber light held. I said, you came to find me because of the paper. Yes, and you stayed because, she said, the courtyard. I looked at her. She looked at me. The expression on her face was the undefended one, the one that cost her something to let me see. And I understood then, with the particular clarity of understanding that comes through the body before it reaches the mind, that the smoked cedar and cold iron and rain on stone and the new amber warmth of it were all components of a single fact. She was terrified, and she was choosing this anyway. Which is what made it different from every other version of power I had ever encountered. I said, I love you. She went very still, the still point, not the cold version. She said, I love you, and it came out the way a fact comes out when it's been true for longer than you've been saying it, certain and almost relieved. The amber light held. The river went dark. I reached across the couch and put my hand on her jaw the way she had on mine in the hallway, specific and deliberate, and she leaned into it and closed her eyes, which was the most unguarded thing I had ever seen her do, and I held her face in my hand and thought, here is where the paper led. Here is what the gap in step 4 was for. September came. The lab work advanced. The paper was drafted, revised, submitted to a journal 3 tiers above the student showcase, and sent out for peer review with a note in the cover letter that the preliminary data was collected at the Vail Institute under fellowship conditions that were on record and available for verification. On a Thursday evening in late September, Cassian came to pick me up from the university rather than meet me at the institute, which was unusual. She arrived at the main gate in the long charcoal coat. Autumn now. The coat was back, and the last of the evening's students were crossing the courtyard, and I walked toward her from the science block with my bag and my thermos. The same thermos, slightly less dented now. And I watched the courtyard do the thing it had done in March, the quiet, the redistribution of air, the held breath. And she walked past all of them and looked only at me. There was a specific geometry to it. Priya Solano was standing near the fountain with a group of second years, and she saw, and the seeing went across her face in a particular way, and then she looked away, which was the most honest thing she had done in my presence in 3 years. Cassian reached me. She took the thermos from my hand and held it. She said, "Hello." I said, "Hello." She looked at me with the look. The courtyard look, but close now. "You're smiling," she said. "What happened?" "The peer review came back," I said. The thing in her expression, the almost smile, finally becoming the thing itself. "Complete and minor revisions," I said. "They called the hypothesis substantially novel and the data methodologically sound." "Methodologically sound," she said. "I can live with methodologically sound." I laughed. She smiled, the full smile, which I had by now a working count of and which still stopped me, a little, every time. She handed the thermos back and offered her arm, the way she had taken my hand in July, with the same deliberate, unhurried specificity. I took it. We walked through the courtyard and out the main gate and onto the street, the autumn air carrying cedar and orange blossom in proportions that had become, over the months, as natural as any weather. Behind us, the courtyard breathed. On a night in October, we were at the 14th floor apartment, and the risotto was on the stove, and the river was black and gold through the window, when Cassian turned from the stove and said, "I need to ask you something." The register of it stopped me. Not the usual precision register, not the warm evening register, something else. Careful in a different way. "Ask," I said. She turned off the burner. She set the spoon down. She crossed the kitchen and stood in front of me, and she said, "I have been thinking about what comes next. The paper publishes in February," I said. "The fellowship extends through spring." "The methodology track, not the research," she said. "Us," I held the counter's edge. "Us, what we are," she said. "What I want us to be. What the next 10 years look like, if we're building them together." She looked at me with the look. I am not accustomed to thinking about the next 10 years in terms of one other person. I have been building a very large structure for a very long time, and I have been building it alone, and I find that I don't want to anymore. I find that I want. She stopped. "I would like you to understand what I'm asking." "I understand what you're asking," I said. Quietly, "I'm asking if you want to build it with me," she said. Formally, specifically, claimed, the words sat in the air between us with the weight of the whole apparatus of our biology, the bond, the mark, the formal biological fact of us. She was not asking abstractly. She was asking precisely. I said, "You're proposing." "I am asking," she said, "whether you would like to be proposed to." Because I want to do it correctly. I looked at her in the kitchen light, this woman who had walked into a courtyard and stopped walking, who had read a paper 18 months before and come looking for its author, who had filed evidence timestamps and dinner disclosures and board documentation and lemon cuttings, who had said I would like to earn the right and then spent 7 months earning it, who had stood at a threshold and waited. I said, "Yes, I'd like to be proposed to." She left the kitchen. She came back in 45 seconds, which I counted, holding a small dark box. She opened it on the counter between us. The ring inside was not what I expected. It was not a large stone. It was a narrow band of dark metal with a single inset of what looked, in the kitchen light, like actual amber, warm and resinous, and the exact color of the rain on stone warmth in her scent on the evenings she had let herself be undefended. She had had it made. It was specific to a conversation we had had, in passing, about my mother's belief that anything that needed direct sunlight was honest. Amber was fossilized sunlight. She had heard that. She had filed it. She had come back to it. She looked at me. She said, "Nadia Voss, you wrote a paper in a student journal that no one of consequence was supposed to read, and I read it 4 times, and I came looking for you, and I found you standing at the edge of a fountain in a cardigan that had been to war, not looking at me. I have been looking at you ever since, and I don't intend to stop. Will you? Yes, I said. I haven't finished. Yes, I said. The almost smile, becoming the real smile, becoming something that didn't have a previous category in my working taxonomy of her expressions. Will you bond with me? She said. Will you let me be the person who stands between you and the version of the world that thinks you're invisible? Will you build the next thing with me? Yes, I said, for the third time. Yes to all of it. Yes, she put the ring on my finger. It fit exactly, which told me she had obtained the measurement without my knowing, which told me everything. She kissed me. I kissed her back. The risotto was cold by the time we ate it, and it was still excellent. The bonding was a winter thing, a December ceremony. Small, the river in the window, and Ren Salter in the front row, with the expression of someone who has been cataloging the significant for 11 years and recognizes a landmark entry when she sees one. Sarah was beside me in a plum blazer that matched mine by design and cried with the composure of someone who had already used up all her crying the night before and was rationing the remainder. Cassian wore charcoal, of course she did, with her hair down, which I had seen before, but not in a room full of witnesses, and she looked at me from the front of the room with the look, and I walked toward it. We said vows we had written ourselves. Hers were precise and specific and contained 3 exact callbacks: the thermos, the step 4 gap, the lemon cuttings, planted like evidence and paid in full. Mine were shorter. I said, you were the first person who read what I wrote and then came to find me. I said, I didn't know that was what I was waiting for until it happened. I said, I will always leave the light on for you, which was the refrain she had said in October when I asked what she promised, and which she heard now with the expression of someone who had been waiting to hear it come back. The claiming bite was at the close of the ceremony, gait and response, and then the real thing, her mouth at the junction of my neck and shoulder, deliberate and unhurried. And the bond snap was not the word snap at all, but the word settle, like a key in a lock that was built for it, like the mass spec output matching the prediction exactly. Her scent and mine became a third thing, cedar and orange blossom and amber and rain on stone, and the room filled with it. Ren Salter said afterward, with her proprietary warmth fully visible for the first and only time in my experience of her, in 11 years, she has never waited for anyone. I want you to know that. I held Ren Salter's statement and the chipped mug and the amber ring and the bond warmth that was sitting in my sternum like banked fire. By February, the paper had published the peer-reviewed, methodologically sound, substantially novel paper in the Journal of Molecular Biosystems Endocrinology that had Dr. Nadia Voss-Weil listed as lead author. The suppression pathway argument, step 4, corrected and airtight. The department at Vellentry ran the paper in a faculty email with a note that said the work was conducted under Institute Fellowship conditions, which was true, and that it represented a significant contribution, which was an understatement. Priya Solano liked the article on the faculty network. I noticed. I filed it under. Too little, much too late, and somewhat funny. Delicante sent a personal email that said he was proud, which I believed he meant, and which I received with the particular grace of someone who has stopped needing validation from the people who were too comfortable to provide it when it counted. Imelda Crane's name disappeared from the Institute's board within the month. A restructuring, the Institute's communications department said. The 2 aligned votes departed with her. I read the press release twice and then filed it in the category of punished and accounted for, no further attention required. 6 months after the bonding, we were in the Mountain House, a place Cassian had kept closed for 11 years, the place with the terraced garden and the rain on cedar bark smell, the place her mother had planted and tended. We had opened it in the spring and spent a week finding out which beds had survived on their own and which needed attention. More had survived than either of us expected. The lemon tree at the south wall was 17 years old and specific about its preferences and producing fruit at a rate that required decisions. It was the morning of our last day before returning to the city. The light came in early through the east window, the particular mountain light that is more gold than amber, and Cassian was asleep on her side, which was the position that her face did the undefended thing in, and I was awake because I had been awake since 5:43 in a state that was not distress, but its opposite, a state of too much warmth to sleep through. I looked at the light. I looked at her. I thought about the courtyard, March, the east fountain, the thermos, the one look. Every girl in that courtyard had been looking at her. She had walked past all of them. She had looked only at me, for 2 seconds, maybe 3, and then she had gone into the administrative building, and the courtyard had exhaled, and I had stood at the edge of the fountain and thought, I know that name. I had known the name. I had known the papers. I had not known that the papers had already found me first. The mountain light held. The garden was quiet. The lemon tree at the south wall was doing what lemon trees do in sunlight, which is to exist with a specific, unhurried honesty, and the smell of it came through the window and joined the cedar and the orange blossom and the rain on stone and the amber warmth of everything we had built in the year between the courtyard and this morning. She opened her eyes. She found me, already looking. She said, "How long have you been awake?" "Since 5:43, I said. That's specific. I counted. I looked at her. The gold light, the undefended face. I was thinking about the courtyard. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What about it? That you walked past everyone," I said, "and looked only at me." She looked at me with the look, close now, the mountain morning warm and golden between us. "Yes," she said. I did. "Why?" I said. The oldest question. The first one. Still the right one. She said, "Because I had read your paper, and I had been looking for you, and when I found you, standing at that fountain, not looking at anyone, looking at the building like you already knew what you were going to do." I understood that I had been correct about the paper, that the person who had written it was exactly who I thought. She reached across and put her hand on mine, the ring warm between our fingers. "You were the most specific person in the room." The mountain light held. The window held. The lemon tree's specific, honest smell held. I had been invisible for a long time. I had been defective late presenter invisible for long enough that I had stopped expecting to be otherwise, had organized my life around the strategies of invisibility the way you organize furniture around a room's fixed dimensions. I had thought that was the shape of things. The shape of things, it turned out, was this. A woman who read a paper and came looking for its author. A courtyard in March, and a look that lasted 2 seconds, and a name said correctly. A gap in step 4, and lemon cuttings, and the chipped mug, and the amber ring, and a morning in the mountains with the light coming in gold and the garden alive outside the window, and the whole weight of being finally, completely, irrevocably seen settled in my chest like something that had always been there, waiting for the right conditions to stop being a hypothesis and become a fact. To be loved by someone who chooses you without condition is not luck. It is not biology. It is the most precise thing I know how to name. It is someone deciding that what you are is exactly what they were looking for, and then spending every day of their life making sure you know it. The end. If this story found something true in you, the invisibility, the impossible wait for the one person who actually looks, subscribe to the channel and stay close. There's so much more coming. And I'd love to know, What was the moment in this story that hit you hardest? Was it Cassian walking past everyone in that courtyard, or the night she brought Nadia the lemon cuttings? Tell me in the comments. The next story is already waiting, and I think you're going to love where it goes.